The year is 1324. An aging man lies dying in Venice, his memories filled with palaces of jade, deserts that swallowed armies whole, and a Khan who ruled more territory than Rome ever dreamed of. His neighbours think he's a liar. They've been calling him Marco Millions for years, mocking the impossible numbers he claims, the unbelievable distances, the preposterous wealth. On his deathbed, a priest begs him to confess, to finally admit he made it all up. His response, "I have not told half of what I saw." This is Marco Polo, and whether you believe him or not, his story changed how Europe saw the world forever. But here's what's strange. Almost everything you think you know about Marco Polo is probably wrong. He wasn't the first European to reach China. He wasn't even the first in his own family. He may not have written the book that bears his name, and there's a very real possibility that some of the most famous parts of his journey never happened at all. So why do we remember him? Why does his name endure when dozens of other medieval travellers have been forgotten? That's the real question. And the answer takes us from the canals of Venice to the steppes of Mongolia, from the court of the most powerful man on earth to a prison cell where one of history's most influential books was born. Let's start at the beginning. Not Marco's beginning, but Venice's. In the 13th century, Venice wasn't part of Italy. Italy didn't exist yet. Venice was something stranger and more powerful, a republic built on water, a city-state that had turned geography into empire. While other medieval cities huddled behind stone walls, Venice sprawled across 100 islands in a lagoon, connected by bridges and canals, protected by the sea itself. The Venetians had figured something out that most of Europe hadn't. Trade, not conquest, was the path to wealth. They didn't need massive armies or fertile farmland. They needed ships, and they needed connections. By Marco Polo's time, Venetian merchants operated across the Mediterranean, from Constantinople to Alexandria, from Acre to Trebizond. They bought and sold everything: silk, spices, slaves, grain, gold, glass. They were middlemen on an epic scale, and they were getting rich doing it. The city itself was unlike anywhere else in medieval Europe. Stone buildings rose directly from the water. Gondolas replaced carts. The air smelled of salt and tar and distant spices. The Rialto market hummed with a dozen languages. You could see Greek sailors and Arab traders, Armenians and Germans and Jews, all doing business in the same crowded squares. Venice faced east, always east, toward the source of the luxuries that made fortunes. Into this world, sometime around 1254, Marco Polo was born. We don't know the exact date. Medieval record-keeping wasn't what it is now. We know his family lived in the parish of San Giovanni Crisostomo, in a respectable but not wealthy neighbourhood. We know his father, Niccolò, and his uncle, Maffeo, were merchants. And we know one thing that shaped Marco's entire childhood. His mother died when he was young, and his father was almost never there. Niccolò and Maffeo weren't local traders. They operated on the long-distance routes, the dangerous ones, the ones that took years. In 1260, when Marco was about 6 years old, his father and uncle left Venice on a trading expedition to Constantinople and the Black Sea. They would not return for 9 years. Think about that. Marco spent his entire childhood without his father. He was raised by extended family, growing up in a city where everyone's father, uncle, or brother was away on some distant voyage, where ships returned with cargo but not always with men. Venice was a city of widows and waiting. What was that childhood like? We can only guess. The book that would make Marco famous tells us almost nothing about his early years. But we know he was educated, probably by tutors, probably in the basics required of a merchant's son. Reading, writing, arithmetic, some Latin. He learned the geography of trade routes, the languages of commerce, the art of keeping accounts. Venice didn't produce scholars or knights, it produced merchants, and merchants needed practical knowledge. He would have learned French, the language of international trade. He likely picked up some Greek, essential for dealing with Byzantine merchants. Perhaps some Arabic, useful in the Levantine ports. Languages weren't academic exercises in Venice. They were tools, and tools made money, and he would have absorbed the stories. Venice ran on stories. Every ship that returned brought news from distant ports. Sailors spoke of storms that destroyed entire fleets, of pirates off the Barbary coast, of the unimaginable wealth of Alexandria, of the Mongol horsemen who had conquered everything from Poland to Persia. These weren't fairy tales. They were intelligence, commercial intelligence, the kind that told you where to invest and where to avoid. The Mongols. That's the context that matters. While Marco was growing up in Venice, the world was being remade by the greatest empire in history. In 1206, a man named Temujin had unified the Mongol tribes and taken the title Genghis Khan. What followed was conquest on a scale never seen before or since. The Mongols swept across Asia like a storm, destroying armies, obliterating cities, absorbing territory at a rate that seems impossible even now. By Marco's childhood, Genghis Khan was dead, but his descendants ruled from Hungary to Korea. The Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire ever created. It stretched across a third of the known world. And here's what mattered to Venice. The Mongols had made the Silk Road safe. For centuries, the overland routes between Europe and China had been fragmented, controlled by dozens of different kingdoms and tribes, each demanding payment, each representing danger. The Mongols changed that. Under Mongol rule, you could travel from the Black Sea to the Pacific with a single passport. Bandits were ruthlessly suppressed. Way stations were established. Merchants who could reach Mongol territory found opportunities that had been closed for generations. The Polo brothers, Niccolo and Maffeo, figured this out before most. When they left Venice in 1260, they were heading to Constantinople to collect on a debt. From there, they moved to the Crimea, where they had a trading post. Then a local war cut off their return route. Instead of waiting it out, they decided to go deeper. They joined a caravan heading east into Mongol territory. This is where the story becomes extraordinary. The Polo brothers travelled to Bukhara, in what's now Uzbekistan, and stayed there for 3 years, learning the language, making connections. Then an envoy of Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler of China, passed through and invited them to continue east. They accepted. The journey took another year. They crossed deserts and mountain ranges, passed through cities whose names sounded like myths. And in 1265, they arrived at Kublai Khan's court. Kublai Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan and the ruler of the largest portion of the Mongol Empire. He had conquered the Song dynasty in southern China and was in the process of establishing the Yuan dynasty, the first foreign dynasty to rule all of China. He was, without exaggeration, the most powerful man on earth. And he was curious. The Mongols had conquered the world, but they were always interested in learning from the cultures they absorbed. Kublai Khan asked the Polo brothers about Europe, about the Pope, about Christianity. He treated them well, gave them gifts, and then sent them back with a request: bring me 100 learned men who can teach my people about your religion and your science. The brothers reached Venice in 1269. Niccolo discovered that his wife had died and that he had a 15-year-old son named Marco whom he barely remembered. They reported to the Pope's representatives, who had no intention of sending 100 scholars to Mongolia. After 2 years of waiting, the Polos decided to return east anyway, this time with only 2 Dominican friars as representatives of the church. And this time, they brought Marco. This is where Marco Polo's story really begins. He was 17 years old. He had never left Venice before, and he was about to embark on a journey that would take him farther from home than any European of his generation, into a world that most people in Venice didn't believe existed. The 2 friars turned back almost immediately. The 3 Polos continued alone. What does a 17-year-old think, leaving everything he's ever known? Marco's book doesn't tell us. It describes routes and distances, cities and customs, but almost never emotions. Was he terrified, excited, both? We don't know. What we know is that he adapted. The journey to Kublai Khan's court took 3.5 years. 3.5 years of travelling through terrain that had no names in European languages, through climates that Venice had never prepared him for. They crossed the Mediterranean to Acre, then travelled overland through Armenia and Persia. They skirted the edge of the Pamir Mountains, which Marco would later describe as the roof of the world, where the air was so thin that fires burned with a different coloured flame. They crossed the Taklamakan Desert, whose name means, "Go in and you won't come out." They passed through cities that controlled key points on the Silk Road: Balkh, Kashgar, Yarkand. They saw Buddhist monasteries carved into cliff faces, Muslim cities with minarets that seemed to touch the sky, and Nestorian Christian communities that had been isolated from Rome for centuries. And everywhere they saw evidence of Mongol power. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was in full effect. Roads were maintained, travellers were protected. The postal system, the yam, could move messages across the empire faster than any European courier system. Way stations provided food and fresh horses. It was, in its own brutal way, efficient. Marco was learning languages. He picked up Persian, essential for travel in Central Asia. He learned Mongolian, necessary at court. Later, he would claim to know 4 languages, though scholars still debate which ones. What's clear is that he had a gift for communication, for observation, for remembering details that would matter later. They reached Kublai Khan's summer capital of Chengdu in 1275. Marco was 21 years old. He had been travelling for nearly 4 years, and he was about to meet the man who ruled a quarter of humanity. Chengdu was unlike anything in Europe. The Chinese called it Xanadu, and later an English poet who had never seen it would make that name immortal. It was a planned city, built according to principles of geometry and cosmology that Europeans didn't understand. The palace complex was vast, surrounded by parks stocked with animals for hunting, gardens designed to represent paradise. The Khan moved between Chengdu in the summer and Khanbalik, modern Beijing, in the winter, and the court moved with him. Thousands of officials, soldiers, servants, concubines, and hangers-on. Kublai Khan was in his 60s by then, a large man who had gone soft from decades of good living, but whose mind remained sharp. He received the Polos warmly, remembered their previous visit, and was particularly interested in young Marco. According to the book, Marco impressed the Khan with his intelligence and his manner. Within a short time, he was given positions of responsibility. And this is where the story becomes controversial. Because according to Marco Polo's account, he spent the next 17 years in Kublai Khan's service, travelling throughout the empire on diplomatic missions, serving as an administrator, witnessing the conquest of southern China, observing the wealth and wonders of the most advanced civilization on Earth. 17 years. That's longer than he'd lived in Venice before leaving. He became fluent in Chinese, familiar with Mongol customs, knowledgeable about Asian geography. He saw things no European had seen. He brought back descriptions that would seem like fantasy. But here's the problem. Chinese records from the Yuan dynasty, which are extensive and detailed, never mention him. Not once. No Marco Polo, no foreign administrator with his description, nothing. This absence has led some scholars to argue that he never actually went to China at all, that he collected stories from Persian traders and wrote them down as if they were his own experiences. We'll return to that controversy. For now, what matters is the story as Marco told it. Whether he spent 17 years in China or collected 17 years worth of stories, the account that emerged would reshape European understanding of the world. It would inspire Columbus, influence mapmakers, and plant the seeds of Europe's age of exploration. But before any of that could happen, Marco Polo had to get home, and that journey would prove even more dangerous than the one that brought him east. By 1292, the Polos had been in the east for 17 years. Marco was nearly 40. His father and uncle were old men. They were rich beyond anything they'd imagined when they left Venice, but wealth meant nothing if you died on the Silk Road trying to carry it home. They asked Kublai Khan for permission to leave. He refused. This wasn't personal cruelty. The Khan had grown fond of them. particularly Marco. They were useful. They understood both Eastern and Western ways. They could be trusted with sensitive missions. And Kublai was an old man himself, now in his late 70s. He didn't want to lose people he valued. The Polos were trapped by their own success. Then an opportunity arrived from an unexpected direction. A Mongol princess named Kukuchin was betrothed to Arghun Khan, the Ilkhan of Persia. She needed to travel from China to Persia, a journey of thousands of miles across territories that were theoretically all part of the Mongol Empire, but in practice were increasingly unstable. The overland Silk Road had become dangerous. Rebellions were breaking out. Rival Mongol factions were fighting each other. The usual route was blocked. The solution was to go by sea, south from China through Southeast Asian waters, across the Indian Ocean to Persia. But this required someone who understood navigation, who could manage a large expedition, who had experience with foreign courts and diplomatic protocol. Marco Polo had all of those qualifications. He'd spent years travelling on the Khan's business. He knew the protocols. He could lead an expedition. When the princess's advisors suggested the Polos escort her to Persia, Kublai finally agreed to let them go. In 1292, a fleet of 14 ships carrying Princess Kukuchin, the 3 Polos, and a retinue of several hundred people left the Chinese port of Quanzhou. They sailed south along the coast of Vietnam, through the straits between Sumatra and Malaysia, and into the Indian Ocean. The journey was a nightmare. The ships were Chinese junks, sophisticated vessels with watertight compartments and multiple masts, far more advanced than anything Europe had at the time, but even the best ships couldn't guarantee safety. They stopped in Sumatra for 5 months, waiting out the monsoon season. Marco observed the local customs, the trade in exotic spices, the peculiar animals. When they finally continued, they crossed the Bay of Bengal to Ceylon, then sailed along the coast of India to the Arabian Sea. People died. According to Marco's account, of the 600 who started the journey, only 18 survived. This number is probably exaggerated. The medieval mind loved dramatic figures, but the voyage was certainly deadly. Disease was the main killer. Malaria, dysentery, infections from contaminated water. Some ships may have been lost in storms. Pirates were a constant threat in certain waters. The Polos survived. They always survived. Whether through luck, skill, or the particular protection of being essential to the mission's success, they made it. By the time they reached Persia in 1293, they learned that Arghun Khan had died. His brother now ruled. Princess Kukuchin was married to Arghun's son instead, a political arrangement that worked well enough for everyone involved. The Polos had fulfilled their duty. They were free to go home. They didn't rush. They stayed in Persia for several months, perhaps gathering information, making connections, ensuring they had enough resources for the final leg. Then they travelled through Persia to Trebizond on the Black Sea, a journey through territories that were Muslim, Christian, and everything in between. From Trebizond, they caught a ship to Constantinople. From Constantinople, they finally sailed to Venice. 24 years after leaving, the Polos came home. It was 1295. Marco was 41 years old. His mother had been dead for decades. His friends had aged or disappeared. The Venice he remembered was gone, and nobody believed a word he said. Think about it from the perspective of a Venetian merchant in 1295. These 3 men show up claiming they've been to China, a place that might as well be the moon. They describe cities of millions of people when the largest European cities held barely 100,000. They talk about paper money, which sounds like obvious fraud. They describe coal, black stones that burn, which makes no sense. They claim to have seen asbestos cloth that doesn't burn in fire, which violates everything you know about how the world works. They describe the Khan's palace with its gold and silver walls. They talk about the postal system, with stations every 25 miles. They mention the canals of Khan Balik, the printing of books, the use of movable type. They describe rhinoceroses, which they call unicorns. They talk about crocodiles. They mention paper currency backed by imperial authority rather than precious metal. Every single thing sounds like a lie. The Polos had brought back evidence. They had silks, porcelain, spices, gemstones. But these could have been acquired through intermediaries. Venice traded with Constantinople. Constantinople traded with Persia. Persia traded with India. India traded with China. Goods flowed along those chains. Having Chinese silk didn't prove you'd been to China. What they needed was a book. Not just verbal stories told at dinner parties, but a written account that could be copied, distributed, studied. A book that would force people to consider the possibility that Marco Polo had actually seen what he claimed to see. That book would emerge, but not in the way anyone expected, because 3 years after returning to Venice, Marco Polo was captured in a war, thrown into a Genoese prison, and met a man who would make him immortal. Venice and Genoa were rival maritime republics, both competing for trade dominance in the Mediterranean. Their rivalry occasionally erupted into open warfare. In 1298, Venice and Genoa fought a naval battle near the island of Curzala off the Dalmatian coast. Marco Polo commanded a galley. We don't know if he was a skilled naval officer or simply a wealthy merchant expected to contribute a ship to the war effort. What we know is that Venice lost the battle decisively. Thousands of Venetians were captured. Marco Polo was among them. He was taken to Genoa and imprisoned. Not in a dungeon, the Genoese weren't barbarians, but in reasonably comfortable conditions. Medieval imprisonment for prisoners of war who could eventually be ransomed was more like house arrest than modern incarceration. Prisoners of Marco's class had access to visitors, could receive books and writing materials, could move around within the prison. In that prison, Marco met Rustichello of Pisa. Rustichello was a romance writer, a professional author who specialised in adventure tales about King Arthur and chivalric heroes. He'd also been captured in a different conflict and was serving his own sentence. The two men began talking. Marco told his stories, and Rustichello recognised something valuable. These weren't just dinner party anecdotes. This was material for a book. Not a dry travel log, but an adventure story, a real one. Marco had been everywhere, seen everything. Rustichello knew how to structure narrative, how to pace revelations, how to make a story compelling. They collaborated. Marco provided the content, drawing on notes and memory. Rustichello shaped it into prose. The language they used was Franco-Italian, a hybrid literary language common among educated Italians at the time. The title was simple, The Description of the World. Later copyists would call it The Travels of Marco Polo or Il Milione, possibly referring to Polo's nickname or to the million wonders described within. The structure was unusual. It wasn't a straightforward chronological narrative of Marco's journey. Instead, it was organised geographically, describing regions and cities, their customs, products, and peculiarities. The journey to China is covered quickly. The return journey gets more space, but most of the book is devoted to describing the Mongol Empire itself, its vastness, its wealth, its organisation. Rustichello framed it as a chivalric romance, which was his specialty. The opening invokes God and nobility, promising to describe the great wonders of the world. The language is ornate, filled with superlatives. Everything is the greatest, the richest, the most magnificent. This wasn't Marco's natural voice. It was Rustichello's professional polish. The book was completed around 1299. Marco was released shortly after, ransomed or freed as part of a peace treaty. He returned to Venice and lived there for the next 25 years. He married, had 3 daughters, managed his business affairs, and watched his book spread across Europe in manuscript form. Because here's what happened. The book was immediately popular and immediately controversial. Copyists made copies. Those copies were copied again. Each copy introduced errors, additions, or deletions. Within decades, there were versions in Italian, French, Latin, and other languages. No two manuscripts were identical. We don't have the original. What we have are dozens of variant texts, all claiming to be Marco Polo's account, all different in details. Some versions are longer, including stories not found in others. Some are shorter, condensing or eliminating sections. Later copyists added material they thought was missing or removed things they thought were obviously wrong. The textual history is a nightmare for scholars trying to determine what Marco actually wrote versus what was added later, but the core content was consistent enough, and that content was explosive. Europeans reading Marco Polo's book encountered descriptions that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. China wasn't a barbarous land of pagans. It was more advanced than Europe in almost every measurable way. Larger cities, better infrastructure, more sophisticated government administration, paper money, coal for fuel, printing, porcelain, silk production on an industrial scale, a postal system that made European communications look primitive. The numbers were staggering. Marco described cities of 1 million people. Venice had perhaps 100,000 inhabitants. London had maybe 50,000. Paris was the largest city in Europe, with perhaps 200,000. And Marco was claiming there were multiple Chinese cities that dwarfed them all. He described the Grand Canal, an artificial waterway connecting northern and southern China, hundreds of miles long. Europeans had nothing comparable. He mentioned the organization of the Mongol military, the tax system, the census. He talked about the conquest of southern China by Kublai Khan, the siege tactics used, the naval battles. He described products Europeans had never seen. He talked about paper made from mulberry bark. He mentioned asbestos, calling it salamander wool that wouldn't burn. He described coal as black stones that burned hotter than wood. He talked about oil that seeped from the ground and was used for fuel and medicine, an early description of petroleum. He mentioned customs that seemed bizarre. The Mongols drank fermented mare's milk. They practiced levirate marriage, where a man inherited his deceased brother's wife. They used paper talismans for currency. They employed foreigners in their administration, which is why Marco claimed to have served the Khan. And he described things he got wrong or misunderstood. He called rhinoceroses unicorns, expecting the elegant creatures from European legend and finding something very different. He confused some place names. He sometimes exaggerated numbers or repeated stories he'd heard without witnessing them himself. The book was full of wonders, but it was also frustratingly vague about certain things. Marco rarely dated events precisely. He didn't describe his journey day by day. He glossed over years of his life in a sentence or two. The book wasn't a diary, it was a description, and description was what interested his audience. Some readers believed him, others were skeptical. Many thought he was exaggerating, that even if he'd been to the East, he was inflating the numbers and embellishing the wonders to make a better story. The nickname Il Milione might have been mocking Marco Millions, the man who claimed everything was in the millions. On his deathbed in 1324, friends reportedly urged Marco to confess that he'd made it all up, to admit the exaggerations and clear his conscience. According to the story, he refused. His response, "I have not told half of what I saw." Whether that's true or legend, it captures something essential about how Marco Polo saw himself. Not as a fraud or an exaggerator, but as someone who had witnessed things so extraordinary that no description could do them justice. The world he'd seen was larger, stranger, and more magnificent than any words could convey. But here's where things get complicated. Because for all the book's influence, for all the copies that circulated, for all the readers who were inspired by it, there's a fundamental question that scholars still argue about today, 7 centuries later. Did Marco Polo actually go to China? Or did he compile an elaborate account based on stories he heard from others? The evidence is maddeningly ambiguous, and the answer matters more than you might think. The case against Marco Polo's authenticity is surprisingly strong, and it starts with what's missing from his book. He never mentions the Great Wall of China. This is astonishing. The wall, even in its earlier form before the Ming dynasty expansions, was one of the most remarkable structures in existence. Anyone travelling overland from the west would have encountered it or heard about it. Marco says nothing. He doesn't mention tea, which by the Yuan dynasty was ubiquitous in Chinese culture. Every traveller who actually visited China commented on it. Marco's silence is deafening. He doesn't describe Chinese writing or printing with movable type, both of which fascinated later European visitors. He doesn't mention foot binding, a practice that shocked every Western observer who encountered tea. He doesn't talk about chopsticks, a detail that seemed exotic and noteworthy to every other European who wrote about China. These aren't minor omissions. These are fundamental aspects of Chinese culture that would have been impossible to miss if you were actually there. Then there's the problem of language. Marco claims to have spent 17 years in China and served in Kublai Khan's administration. Yet there's no evidence he spoke Chinese or Mongolian. The book contains very few Chinese or Mongolian words. The place names he uses are often Persian or Turkic versions, suggesting he might have learned about these places from Persian merchants rather than visiting them himself. And here's something even stranger. Chinese records from the Yuan dynasty are extensive. They document the Kahar, and court in detail, listing foreign officials and visitors. Marco claims to have been a trusted administrator, even governing a city for 3 years. Yet no Chinese source mentions him. Not one. His name doesn't appear, no Marco, no Polo, nothing. Some defenders argue his name might have been transcribed differently, or that records were lost, but the silence is suspicious. The Mongols kept careful records. They documented other European visitors. Why not Marco? Then there's the issue of his itinerary. When you map out the places Marco claims to have visited and calculate the time required to travel between them, the numbers don't quite work. He describes journeys that would have taken years but accounts for them in months. He claims to have visited regions that would have required massive detours from any logical route. Some scholars suggest he might have travelled only as far as the Black Sea or Constantinople, then gathered information from Persian and Arab merchants who had actually been to China. He could have heard their stories, read their accounts, maybe even seen some Chinese goods they'd brought back, and woven it all into a narrative that placed himself at the centre. It wouldn't have been deliberate fraud necessarily, more like what we'd now call historical fiction based on real information. Medieval audiences didn't distinguish between eyewitness accounts and well-informed compilations the way we do. But here's where the argument gets complicated, because while the case against Marco seems strong, the case for him is equally compelling. Start with this. Marco G adds an enormous amount, right? He describes the layout of Kublai Khan's palace with details that match archaeological evidence. He talks about the Khan's hunting parks, their size and organisation, in ways that align with what we know from Chinese sources. He describes administrative systems that wouldn't be confirmed by other sources until much later. He mentions the postal relay system, the paper currency, the coal mining, all things that were real and specific to Yuan China. He gets the geography mostly correct. The distances between cities, the rivers, the mountains, these aren't things you could invent or guess. He describes trade routes with an accuracy that suggests first-hand knowledge. And here's something critics often miss. Marco includes mundane details that serve no narrative RPOs. He talks about the types of birds in different regions. He mentions local building materials. He describes weather patterns. Why would someone inventing the story bother with these boring specifics? They don't make the tale more exciting. They don't impress readers. They're just there. The kind of random observations an actual traveller would note. Then there's the problem of Rustichello. Remember, Marco didn't write this book alone. Rustichello da Pisa was a romance writer, someone who specialised in making stories dramatic and exciting. How much of the book's style, its exaggerations, its sometimes vague chronology, comes from Rustichello's hand rather than Marco's memory? We'll never know. Medieval collaboration didn't work like modern co-authorship. There were no footnotes distinct. Goishing who contributed what? Some scholars have suggested that Marco really did go to China, but perhaps not in the capacity he claimed. Maybe he wasn't a high-ranking administrator. Maybe he was a lower-level merchant, or even just a traveller passing through. The book might have inflated his importance to make it more impressive, but the journey itself could have been real. And there's another possibility that recent scholarship has explored. What if Marco travelled extensively through the Mongol Empire, including regions that were Mongol-controlled but not technically China proper? The Mongol Empire was vast. It included Persia, Central Asia, and parts of what's now Russia. A merchant could travel through Mongol territories, interact with Mongol officials, learn about the Khan's court that roughed the extensive communication networks, and accumulate genuine knowledge about China without necessarily setting foot in Beijing. This would explain both what he got right and what he got wrong. He'd have real information, but filtered through intermediaries. He'd know about Chinese products and customs, but miss details that only direct observation would provide. The debate continues. Scholars publish papers arguing both sides. New evidence emerges, gets debated, and the question remains open. But here's what's undeniable. Whether Marco Polo actually went to China or not, his book changed Europe forever. Because what mattered wasn't the truth of his journey. What mattered was what Europeans did with the information. The book circulated for decades, then centuries. It was copied by hand, translated into multiple languages, and eventually printed when printing technology arrived in Europe. Each generation of readers found something new in it. Merchants saw business opportunities. They read about silks and spices, about markets and trade routes, and they started thinking about how to access that wealth. The overland routes Marco described were difficult and dangerous, controlled by intermediaries who took their cut at every stage. What if there was another way? Explorers saw challenges. They read about distant lands and wondered what else was out there. If China existed with all its wonders, what about the lands beyond? What about the seas to the east? What about routes that didn't require crossing hostile territories? Mapmakers tried to incorporate Marco's information into their understanding of world geography. They drew China on their maps, often wildly inaccurate in placement and size, but present. The world was bigger than they'd thought. There was more to discover, and here's where we get to the part of the story that matters most. The part where a Genoese sailor picks up a copy of Marco Polo's book and starts making notes in the margins. His name was Christopher Columbus, and he was obsessed. Columbus owned a Latin edition of Marco Polo's travels. We know this because the book survived, and it's covered with his handwritten notes. 70 handwritten annotations in the margins, underlining passages, marking sections that interested him. He read about Jipangu, Marco's name for Japan, an island rich in gold where the palaces had roofs made of precious me, et al. He read about the wealth of the Khan's empire, about the cities and the trade goods, and he started thinking. The traditional route to Asia went east, overland through hostile Muslim territories, or south around Africa, if you believed that was even possible. But Columbus had a different idea, one that seems obvious now, but was radical then. What if you could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic? The Earth was round, everyone educated knew that. If you sailed far enough west, you'd eventually reach the east. Simple geometry. The question was distance. How far was it? Columbus calculated based on several sources, including Marco Polo's descriptions of how far East Asia extended. He also relied on other geographical texts, some of which seriously underestimated the Earth's circumference. He convinced himself that Japan was only about 3,000 miles west of the Canary Islands. It was actually more like 12,000, with an entire unknown continent in between. But Columbus didn't know that. Nobody did. He took Marco Polo's descriptions of Asian wealth, combined them with faulty geography and his own burning ambition, and set out to find a western route to the Indies. He'd bring back the silks and spices Marco described. He'd establish trade relations with the Khan. He'd make his fortune and earn his place in history. When Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean on October 12, 1492, he thought he'd succeeded. He believed he was on islands off the coast of Asia. He called the inhabitants Indians because he thought he was in the Indies. He kept expecting to find the cities Marco Polo had described, the palaces and the gold. He explored Cuba, convinced it must be mainland China or at least close to it. He asked the locals about the Khan, using translators and gestures. They had no idea what he was talking about. He never found China. He never found the Khan's empire. What he found was something nobody in Europe had expected. 2 entire continents, full of peoples and civilizations that had developed in complete isolation from the old world. He'd stumbled onto the Americas while looking for Asia, one of history's most consequential mistakes, and it all traces back to a book written in a Genoese prison by a merchant who may or may not have actually made the journey he described. But even that's not the end of Marco Polo's influence, because the age of exploration that Columbus inaugurated, that era of European expansion that would reshape the entire world, was driven in part by the vision of Asia that Marco Polo had planted in European minds. Other explorers followed, each seeking their own route to the wealth of the East. Vasco da Gama finally found the sea route around Africa to India in 1498. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition achieved the first circumnavigation of the globe, proving once and for all that you could reach Asia by sailing west, though it was much farther than Columbus had thought. These journeys opened direct trade routes between Europe and Asia for the first time. The middlemen who had controlled the Silk Road were bypassed. Goods that had been rare and expensive became more available. And eventually, Europeans didn't just trade with Asian powers. They colonized, they conquered, they imposed their own systems of government and economy on much of the world. The consequences, both positive and negative, are still with us today. None of this was Marco Polo's intention, of course. He was just a merchant trying to make sense of what he'd seen or heard, telling his story to pass the time in prison. He couldn't have imagined that his book would inspire the voyages that would connect the world's continents, that would lead to the Columbian Exchange, to colonial empires, to the entire modern global system. But that's how history works sometimes. A book written in 1298 influences a sailor in 1492, whose voyage changes everything. Ideas ripple forward through time in ways their originators never anticipate. So was Marco Polo a liar? Maybe. Was he an exaggerator? Probably. Does it matter? Not as much as you'd think. Because the truth is, Marco Polo's actual journey, whether it happened exactly as he described or not, is less important than the journey his book took through history. The book travelled farther than Marco ever did. It reached more people, changed more minds, and had consequences beyond anything a simple trading voyage could have achieved. And that raises a question about truth and influence that's worth sitting with. Sometimes the stories we tell matter more than the strict facts behind them. Sometimes a flawed account that inspires action shapes the world more than a perfectly accurate record that nobody reads. Marco Polo died in 1324, about 25 years after returning to Venice. He was in his 70s, which was a good run for the medieval period. His last years were spent as a respected, if somewhat eccentric figure in Venetian society. People knew him as the man who'd been to the Khan's court, though plenty of them still doubted his stories. On his deathbed, family members and friends supposedly urged him to retract the more fantastic claims in his book. They wanted him to admit he'd exaggerated, that he'd made some of it up. His response has become famous. "I have not told a half of what I saw." Whether he actually said this is anyone's guess, but it captures something essential about Marco Polo's legacy. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't admitting to fabrication. He was doubling down, insisting that reality had been even stranger than what he'd described. That defiance, real or invented, tells us something about how he saw himself, not as a liar, but as a witness to wonders that exceeded language's capacity to capture them. After his death, the book continued its strange journey through European consciousness. Manuscripts multiplied. Each copy introduced new errors, new interpolations, new embellishments. Scribes added details they'd heard from other travellers. They corrected what they thought were mistakes. They removed sections that seemed too implausible. By the 15th century, there were dozens of versions of the travels circulating, no two quite alike. The original, whatever that was, had dissolved into a cloud of variants. Scholars today still argue about which manuscript is closest to what Polo and Rustichello actually produced in that Genoese prison. But here's what's remarkable. The variations didn't diminish the book's influence. If anything, they amplified it. Each version reached different audiences, emphasized different aspects, sparked different imaginations. The book became a living thing, evolving as it spread, adapting to the interests and prejudices of each new generation of readers. And as it evolved, it kept shaping how Europeans thought about the East. Even after the age of exploration revealed that Polo's geography was often wrong, that his distances were wildly off, that some of his descriptions were clearly second-hand, the book maintained its grip on the European imagination. Why? Because it had given people something they desperately wanted: permission to believe that the world was larger and stranger than their immediate experience suggested. It had opened a door in the mind, and once that door was open, it couldn't be closed. Let's zoom out for a moment and consider what this means. We're living in an age where information is instant and abundant. We can pull up satellite images of anywhere on Earth. We can watch live video from the other side of the planet. We can fact-check claims in seconds. The idea of a single book shaping an entire civilization's understanding of a foreign region seems almost quaint. How could one flawed account have so much power? But that's exactly the point. In an information-scarce environment, the few sources that exist become enormously influential. Medieval Europeans couldn't Google, "What is China actually like?" They had Marco Polo's book, a handful of other travel accounts, and their own imaginations. That's it. So when Polo described Kublai Khan's empire, he wasn't just providing information. He was filling a vacuum. He was giving shape to the unknown. And in that process, he was inevitably distorting it. Because no single account, no matter how honest, can capture the full complexity of an entire civilization. This is the core problem with all travel writing, really. The observer is always limited by their own perspective, their own cultural assumptions, their own ability to understand what they're seeing. Marco Polo looked at Yuan dynasty China through the eyes of a 13th century Venetian merchant. He noticed what someone with his background would notice. He missed what someone with his background would miss. He paid close attention to trade goods, to currency systems, to administrative structures, because those were things he understood and valued. He was less interested in, say, Chinese philosophy or literature or art, except as curiosities. His account reflects his priorities, not some objective truth about China, and yet his account became the truth about China for generations of Europeans. This is how knowledge works when sources are scarce. The first account, the most widely circulated account, the most readable account becomes definitive, regardless of its limitations. Now think about how this pattern repeats throughout history. How many other first accounts have shaped entire civilizations' understanding of foreign places or peoples? How many other Marco Polos, writing from their own limited perspectives, have created images that persist long after the reality has changed or been revealed as more complex? The answer is most of them. Nearly every early cross-cultural encounter produces accounts that later generations recognize as partial, biased, or simply wrong in crucial ways. But by then, the damage or the influence, depending on how you look at it, has already been done. Marco Polo's book had one more crucial impact that we haven't fully explored yet. It changed how Europeans thought about travel itself. Before the travels, the few Europeans who ventured far from home usually did so for specific, limited purposes: pilgrimage to holy sites, diplomatic missions, military campaigns, trade expeditions along established routes. Polo's account suggested something different, that travel could be an end in itself, that encountering foreign cultures could be valuable even if it didn't result in immediate material gain, that there was knowledge to be acquired simply by going and looking. This might not sound revolutionary, but it was. It planted the idea that the world was worth exploring, not just for what you could extract from it, but for what you could learn about it. That curiosity, not just commerce, was a legitimate motivation for enduring the hardships of long-distance travel. You can trace a line from Marco Polo's account to the European voyages of exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries, and from there to the scientific expeditions of the 18th and 19th centuries, where naturalists and geographers travelled the world systematically documenting what they found. The DNA of modern travel writing, of ethnography, of cross-cultural study, all of it contains fragments of what Marco Polo started. Which brings us to a bigger question: what do we do with a source that's both influential and unreliable? How do we think about Marco Polo's book, knowing what we now know about its limitations? We could dismiss it as worthless, a tissue of lies and exaggerations that deserves to be forgotten. Some historians have essentially taken this position, arguing that the book should be treated as historical fiction rather than historical evidence. Or we could recognize it for what it actually is: a flawed, partial, biased, but nonetheless remarkable attempt by one person to make sense of experiences that exceeded his frame of reference. And more importantly, a text that, regardless of its factual accuracy, shaped how millions of people thought and acted. The influence is real, even if the account isn't perfectly accurate. The consequences matter even if the causes are questionable. This is the paradox at the heart of Marco Polo's legacy. Here's another angle worth considering. What if we've been asking the wrong question all along? What if "did Marco Polo really go to China?" is less interesting than "why did so many people want to believe he did?" The book's success suggests it was filling a need. Europeans in the late medieval period were hungry for information about the wider world. They were curious about foreign peoples and places. They wanted to believe that there were empires and wonders beyond their immediate horizons. Marco Polo gave them that. Whether he personally witnessed everything he described or compiled it from multiple sources becomes, in this reading, almost beside the point. He was serving as a conduit, a translator, a bridge between East and West. The fact that the bridge was a bit rickety doesn't mean it didn't successfully carry traffic. And maybe that's the most honest way to think about the travels. Not as a factual record or as a deliberate fabrication, but as something in between. A text that blends observation, hearsay, imagination, and cultural translation in ways that can't be neatly separated. This is uncomfortable for us. We want our sources to be either reliable or fraudulent. We want to know whether to trust them or dismiss them. But most historical sources, if we're honest, fall into a murky middle ground. They're partially accurate, partially distorted, partially useful, partially misleading. Marco Polo's book is just an extreme example of this universal problem. The extremity makes it useful for thinking about how we handle all sources, how we evaluate claims, how we build knowledge from imperfect materials. Because here's the thing, we're still doing it. We're still reading accounts written by people with their own biases and limitations and treating them as windows onto reality. we're still letting compelling narratives shape our understanding, even when we know those narratives are incomplete or skewed. The difference is that now we have more sources to compare, more ways to fact-check, more tools for verification. But the fundamental challenge remains. How do you see the world clearly when you're always looking through someone else's eyes? Marco Polo's book forces us to confront that question because its flaws are so obvious, so well documented, so impossible to ignore, and yet its influence was so profound, so far-reaching, so undeniably real. Let's return to Columbus for a moment, because his relationship with Marco Polo's book illustrates something crucial. Columbus owned a copy. We know this because it survived, covered in his handwritten notes. He'd studied it carefully, marking passages about the Khan's court, about the wealth of Chipangu, about the geography of Asia. But he'd also misread it, or chosen to read it, in the way that supported what he wanted to believe. He'd taken Polo's descriptions of distances and adjusted them to fit his own theories. He'd ignored the parts that didn't match his assumptions and emphasized the parts that did. In other words, Columbus used Marco Polo's book the way people have always used texts, selectively, creatively, in service of their own purposes. The book was influential, not because it was accurate, but because it was malleable. It could be interpreted to support various agendas. This is what happens to influential texts. They become mirrors more than windows. People see in them what they want to see, what they need to see to justify their own actions and beliefs. And here's where the story gets really interesting. Because Marco Polo's influence didn't stop with the age of exploration. His name, his legend, his book continue to echo through the centuries in ways you might not expect. When Europeans eventually did establish sustained contact with China in the 16th and 17th centuries, they brought with them expectations shaped by the travels. Jesuit missionaries who went to the Ming court carried copies of Polo's book. They compared what they found with what Polo had described, looking for continuities and changes. They discovered, unsurprisingly, that China had evolved considerably in the 300 years since Polo's time. The Mongol dynasty had been overthrown. The Ming had rebuilt Chinese institutions. The political and social landscape was utterly different. But the basic image of China as a vast, wealthy, sophisticated empire, that part held up, and that image, first planted by Marco Polo, became the foundation for how Europeans understood China throughout the early modern period. Even when the specifics were wrong, the general framework persisted. This is how influence works across time. The details fade or get corrected, but the underlying narrative, the basic mental model that sticks around. It gets passed from generation to generation, adapted and modified, but never completely abandoned. Fast forward to the 19th century, and you find Western scholars still arguing about Marco Polo. Some defended him as a reliable witness. Others attacked him as a fraud. The debate became a way of working through larger questions about how to evaluate historical sources, about what standards of evidence to apply, about the relationship between travel, observation, and truth. And in the 20th century, the debate continued. Now with new tools. Archaeologists discovered artifacts that seemed to confirm some of Polo's claims. Linguistic analysis revealed possible evidence that he'd been where he said he'd been, but other scholars pushed back, finding new reasons to doubt. The argument will probably never be fully resolved because the evidence is incomplete. We'll never know for certain exactly what Marco Polo saw with his own eyes versus what he heard from others versus what Rustichello embellished. The truth has been lost to time. What we're left with is the impact, and the impact is undeniable. A book written in a prison in 1298 helped trigger a chain of events that connected the world's continents, that launched the modern global system, that changed how millions of people thought about geography and culture and possibility. That's the strange paradox of historical influence. The impact often matters more than the accuracy. A flawed book that changes the world is more historically significant than a perfect book that nobody reads. But let's step back for a moment, because there's another layer to this story that we haven't fully explored yet, the question of what Marco Polo's journey tells us about the medieval world itself. Not just about one man's travels, but about the entire system that made those travels possible. The 13th century was a unique moment in history. For a brief period, roughly 100 years, the Mongol Empire created something unprecedented. A connected zone stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. One could travel from the Black Sea to Beijing, and theoretically at least, remain within territories controlled by branches of the same ruling family. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. Not that the Mongols were gentle rulers. They'd conquered these territories through unprecedented violence. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Entire populations were massacred as examples. The Mongol expansion was one of the bloodiest episodes in human history. But once the conquests were complete, once the empire was established, something remarkable happened. The Mongols, despite their fearsome reputation, turned out to be surprisingly pragmatic administrators. They were interested in trade, in revenue, in the smooth functioning of their domains. And that meant protecting merchants. The Silk Road, that ancient network of trade routes connecting east and west, had existed for over 1,000 years before the Mongols. But it had never been safer or more active than during the Mongol century. Caravans could travel vast distances under Mongol protection. Bandits were ruthlessly suppressed. Relay stations were established at regular intervals. A merchant travelling from Persia to China knew that he'd find food, shelter, and fresh horses at predictable points along the route. This is the world the Polos entered. They weren't pioneers hacking through unexplored wilderness. They were businessmen taking advantage of a functioning commercial infrastructure. The routes they followed had been travelled by thousands of merchants before them. The cities they visited had thriving communities of foreign traders. The goods they bought and sold moved through established networks of middlemen, money changers, and transport specialists. Understanding this context changes how we interpret the story. Marco Polo wasn't a lone explorer venturing into the unknown. He was participating in a globalized medieval economy. Yes, it was remarkable for a Venetian to reach China. The distance was enormous, the journey dangerous, the cultural differences profound. But it wasn't impossible. It was difficult, but doable. And here's what that tells us. The medieval world was more connected than we typically imagine. We tend to think of the Middle Ages as an era of isolation, of separate civilizations existing in ignorance of each other. That's not quite right. There were always connections, always exchanges, always travellers moving between distant regions. Information travelled slowly, but it travelled. Goods moved along trade routes, ideas crossed borders. People learned about distant lands through merchants' reports, through diplomatic missions, through religious pilgrims. What made the 13th century special wasn't the existence of these connections, but their intensity. The Mongol Empire, despite its brutality, briefly created conditions where long-distance travel became more feasible than it had been in centuries, and more feasible than it would be again for centuries after the empire fragmented. Because that's the other crucial point. This window didn't last. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol Empire was fracturing. The descendants of Genghis Khan, who ruled different regions, began fighting each other. The unity that had made safe passage possible was breaking down. Central Asian trade routes became dangerous again. The Black Death, spreading along these same routes, killed millions and disrupted commercial networks. And then, in 1368, the Mongols were finally expelled from China entirely. The Ming dynasty that replaced them was far more isolationist. The new Chinese rulers were less interested in foreign trade, less welcoming to foreign merchants. They turned inward, focusing on consolidating power within China proper, rather than maintaining connections with the outside world. The famous Ming treasure fleets, which briefly sailed as far as East Africa, in the early 15th century were discontinued. China began closing itself off. By the time Columbus sailed west in 1492, the overland route that the Polos had travelled was no longer viable. The old Silk Road networks had decayed. Travel between Europe and China was far more difficult than it had been 200 years earlier. This is partly why Europeans began searching so desperately for sea routes to Asia. The land routes had closed, so Marco Polo's journey happened during a very specific historical moment. A window that opened in the 13th century and closed by the 15th. His book preserved a memory of that moment, a snapshot of what was possible during the Pax Mongolica. And that memory influenced people long after the reality had changed. Now let's talk about what happened to Marco Polo himself after he returned home, because the end of his story is almost as interesting as the beginning. He arrived back in Venice in 1295 after 24 years away. He was 41 years old. His father and uncle were elderly. Venice had changed in their absence. The war with Genoa was still grinding on, and here were these three men, wealthy from their eastern ventures, with incredible stories to tell. Marco resumed his life as a Venetian merchant. He invested his money, probably in various commercial enterprises. He got married to a woman named Donata Badoa. They had 3 daughters together. By all accounts, he settled into a comfortable, respectable existence as a successful businessman. But Venice and Genoa were still fighting, and in 1298, 3 years after his return, Marco Polo found himself caught up in a naval battle. The Venetian fleet was defeated. Marco was captured and taken to Genoa as a prisoner of war. This is how he met Rustichello de Pisa. The 2 men were imprisoned together, both captives of Genoa, though for different reasons. And during their confinement, they collaborated on the book that would make Marco famous. Here's what's interesting. Marco Polo didn't write his own story immediately upon returning home. He lived in Venice for 3 years before he was captured, and apparently during that time, he didn't feel compelled to write anything down. It was only in prison with time on his hands and a professional writer as a cellmate that the book came into existence. What does that tell us? Maybe Marco didn't initially see his travels as particularly significant. Maybe he told stories at dinner parties, impressed friends and business associates, but didn't think anyone beyond his immediate circle would care. Maybe it took imprisonment, forced idleness, and Rustichello's encouragement to convince him that his experiences were worth recording. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe he just needed a collaborator who knew how to structure a narrative, how to turn raw memories into a readable text. Marco was a merchant, not a writer. Rustichello was a professional. The partnership made sense. Either way, the book was written in prison during what must have been one of the more frustrating periods of Marco's life. He'd survived 24 years in Asia, made it home safely, built a new life, and then ended up locked in a Genoese prison because of a war he probably had little personal stake in. He was eventually released, probably as part of a general prisoner exchange, when Venice and Genoa made peace in 1299. He returned to Venice and lived there for the rest of his life. He continued his business activities. He appeared in legal documents, property records, commercial contracts. He witnessed wills, settled disputes, participated in the ordinary affairs of a Venetian merchant. And he had his book. Copies circulated, people read it, debated it, passed it around. During his lifetime, Marco Polo became known as Il Milione, a nickname that meant different things depending on who you asked. Some said it referred to the millions of things he'd seen. Others said it was mocking, implying he exaggerated everything by 1,000,000 times. The name stuck either way. He died in 1324 at about 70 years old. His will survives. In it he freed a Tartar slave who'd served him for years, a man who'd apparently travelled back from Asia with the Polos. He divided his estate among his wife and daughters. He made bequests to various religious institutions. It was a conventional will. the document of a prosperous but not extraordinarily wealthy man. And that's it. That's the end of Marco Polo's personal story. He lived, he travelled, he returned, he wrote a book, and he died, unremarkable in many ways. Just another Venetian merchant who happened to travel farther than most. But the book outlived him. That's the crucial part. The physical Marco Polo died in 1324, but the textual Marco Polo, the character in the travels, became immortal. That version lived on, copied and recopied, translated and retranslated, read and reread by generation after generation. And here's where we need to talk about something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Marco Polo: the role of medieval manuscript culture in shaping his legacy. Books in the medieval period weren't mass-produced. Each copy was handwritten, painstakingly created by scribes working with quill pens on parchment or vellum. This process was slow, expensive, and prone to errors. Scribes made mistakes. They misread words, skipped lines, inserted their own interpretations. And then subsequent scribes copied those errors, sometimes correcting them, sometimes compounding them. The result was that no two medieval manuscripts were exactly alike. Each copy of a text was unique, containing its own particular combination of accurate passages, errors, and variations. This was especially true for vernacular texts, works written in French or Italian rather than Latin. Latin texts were copied more carefully because they were used for religious and scholarly purposes where accuracy mattered intensely. Vernacular texts were treated more casually. The Travels of Marco Polo exists in about 150 different medieval manuscripts, and no two are identical. Some versions are in French, some in Italian, some in Latin. Some are longer, some shorter. Some include episodes that others omit. Some have different place names or different descriptions of the same events. Some versions seem to reflect Rustichello's original text more faithfully. Others show evidence of heavy editing by later scribes. What this means is that Marco Polo's book is not really one book. It's a family of related texts, all stemming from a common source but diverging in countless small ways. Scholars have spent decades trying to work out which versions are closest to the original, which changes were made by Rustichello versus Marco versus later scribes. It's painstaking work, comparing manuscripts word by word, trying to construct a family tree of textual variations. And this textual instability contributed to Marco Polo's influence. Because different readers encountered different versions of the story, the Marco Polo that Columbus read wasn't quite the same as the Marco Polo that a merchant in 15th century Florence read. Each version emphasized different aspects, included different details, created slightly different impressions. This multiplicity meant the book could serve many purposes. Scholars could read it as a geographical treatise. Merchants could read it as a commercial guide. Crusade propagandists could read it as evidence of Christian communities in the East. Dreamers could read it as an adventure story. The text was flexible enough to accommodate all these readings because it existed in so many slightly different forms. And beyond the manuscript variations, there were the translations. The book was translated into multiple languages during the medieval period, from Franco-Italian into Latin, into Tuscan Italian, into Venetian dialect, into German, into Spanish. Each translation was itself an interpretation, with the translator making choices about how to render ambiguous passages, which episodes to emphasize, how to adapt the text for a new audience. By the time printed editions appeared in the late 15th century, the book had already gone through multiple generations of copying, editing, translating, and adapting. The first printed edition, published in German in 1477, was based on one particular manuscript tradition. Other printed editions followed, based on other traditions. Even in print, there was no single, authoritative version. This matters because it shows how influence really works. Marco Polo's influence wasn't about a single text faithfully transmitted across centuries. It was about a story that multiplied, that adapted, that changed shape depending on who was reading it and why. The instability was the power, and this brings us to the great paradox of Marco Polo's legacy. The more we examine the evidence, the more questions emerge about what actually happened. Questions that have divided scholars for generations and remain unresolved today. The doubts began early. Even in Marco Polo's lifetime, some people didn't believe him. When he returned to Venice in 1295 after 24 years away, dressed in worn Tartar clothing and speaking Italian with a strange accent, his own family reportedly didn't recognize him. He had to prove his identity, and when he started telling stories about the East, about cities with millions of inhabitants, about paper money and coal that burned, about the wealth and power of the great Khan, many Venetians thought he was exaggerating or simply making things up. The nickname Il Milione might have originated as mockery. Marco kept talking about millions, millions of people, millions of stones in palace walls, millions of ships in Chinese ports. To medieval Venetians who lived in a city of perhaps 80,000, these numbers seemed absurd. The nickname stuck, and it wasn't necessarily meant as a compliment. On his deathbed in 1324, priests and friends supposedly urged Marco to confess that he'd made it all up. The skepticism never entirely disappeared. Over the centuries, scholars have raised increasingly sophisticated objections. These aren't simple accusations of fraud. They're careful analyses of what's present in the text and what's conspicuously absent. He never mentions Chinese writing. The Chinese script is one of the most obvious differences between Chinese and European civilization. Marco discusses Chinese books, Chinese documents, Chinese administration, but he never describes what Chinese characters look like or how they function as a writing system. These omissions are puzzling. They're not exotic details that might have escaped notice. They're basic, everyday aspects of Chinese life that any European visitor would have encountered constantly. Francis Wood, a scholar who worked at the British Library, published a controversial book in 1995, arguing that Marco Polo never went to China at all. She suggested that he got his information secondhand, perhaps from Persian merchants he met in Constantinople or the Black Sea ports, and that he compiled his book from their stories plus material from existing travel literature. Wood's argument goes beyond the omissions. She points out that Marco Polo's name never appears in Chinese records. The academic response to Wood was fierce. Most Marco Polo scholars rejected her thesis, though they acknowledged that her questions were legitimate. They offered counter-arguments. Yes, Marco doesn't mention the Great Wall, but the wall as we know it mostly dates from after his time. The earlier walls were less impressive and might not have seemed worth mentioning. Yes, he doesn't mention tea, but perhaps he considered it too mundane. Europeans didn't drink tea yet, so maybe he didn't recognize it as significant. The foot-binding omission is harder to explain, but perhaps Marco's social circle didn't include Chinese women of the class who practiced it. As for Chinese records, the absence of Marco's name might simply reflect gaps in what survives. Many Yuan dynasty documents were lost, and Marco might have been known by a different name in Chinese contexts. Some scholars have suggested he might be identifiable as a certain Boluo who appears in some records, though this identification is speculative. The Persian place names make sense because Marco was working for Mongol rulers who used Persian as their administrative language. He would have learned the Mongol and Persian names for places, not necessarily the Chinese ones. And the argument that his information wasn't unique misses the point. The book's influence didn't come from revealing completely unknown facts. It came from the way Marco Polo told the story, from the details he included, from the sense of authority and eyewitness testimony. But here's what makes this debate fascinating. Both sides have valid points, and the evidence doesn't definitively resolve the question. We're left with genuine uncertainty about one of history's most famous journeys. What's not in doubt is that someone travelled extensively in Asia. The book contains too much accurate detail about Persian, Central Asian, and Mongol geography, and customs to be pure invention. The descriptions of Mongol court life, of the postal system, of administrative practices, these ring true and match what we know from other sources. The question is how far east that someone travelled and what they actually witnessed versus what they learned from others. One possibility is that Marco Polo went to China but spent most of his time in Mongol circles rather than among Chinese people. The Mongols ruled China but remained culturally separate. They maintained their own customs, spoke their own language, and often employed foreigners rather than Chinese in important positions. If Marco moved primarily in Mongol administrative circles, he might have had limited exposure to Chinese culture itself. This would explain why he knows so much about Mongol administration, but relatively little about distinctively Chinese customs. He was in China geographically, but he was in a Mongol bubble culturally. Another possibility is that Marco went to China, saw these things, but Rustichello edited them out. Remember, Rustichello was writing an adventure romance for a European audience. Chinese writing systems and chopsticks might have seemed too mundane or too difficult to explain. He might have focused on what would seem most exciting and comprehensible to his readers, cutting details that didn't serve the narrative. Or perhaps the original account did include these details, but they were lost in the copying process. Given that no original manuscript survives and that different versions vary wildly, it's possible that some scribe along the way removed passages they didn't understand or didn't consider important. The most radical possibility is that Marco Polo went part way, perhaps to the Mongol court at Karakoram or to Persia, but not all the way to China. He then heard detailed accounts from merchants and travellers who had been further east, and he incorporated their stories into his own. This would make him less a fraud than an early travel writer who blurred the line between personal experience and researched material. We'll probably never know for certain. The evidence is fragmentary, the sources are problematic, and the questions are genuinely difficult. But here's what matters for understanding Marco Polo's impact. The historical question of whether he went to China is actually separate from the question of why his book influenced European exploration. Columbus believed Marco Polo had been to China. The Portuguese navigators believed it. The map makers believed it. They didn't have access to Chinese records. They couldn't check Marco's claims against independent sources. They took the book at face value, as an eyewitness account of the East, and based on that belief, they made decisions. They funded expeditions. They risked their lives sailing into unknown waters. They redrew maps and reimagined the world. The influence was real, even if the journey might not have been exactly as described. This tells us something important about how ideas shape history. It's not always the truth that matters. It's what people believe to be true. Marco Polo's book created a mental map of Asia in European minds. That map was detailed, vivid, and compelling. It made the East seem knowable, reachable, worth pursuing. Whether every detail was accurate, whether Marco personally witnessed everything he described, these questions didn't matter to the explorers who came after. They had a story. The story gave them direction and motivation. The story changed what they thought was possible. And in changing what seemed possible, the story changed what actually happened. By the time scholars started seriously questioning Marco Polo's veracity in the 20th century, his work had already accomplished what it was going to accomplish. Ships had sailed, continents had been discovered, trade routes had been established, empires had risen and fallen, the world had been remapped. You can't undo influence after the fact. You can question the source, but you can't erase the consequences. This is Marco Polo's ultimate legacy. Not the book itself, but what the book did. Not the journey, but the journeys it inspired. Not the truth of his account, but the way his account changed how Europeans understood their place in the world and what they might achieve by venturing beyond it. And this brings us to the final question. Why did Marco Polo's story succeed where others failed? Other travellers had been to Asia. Other books had described the East. Some were more accurate, some were more detailed, but none had the impact of Marco Polo's travels. The answer lies not in what the book said, but in when it said it and how it was told. The timing was perfect, the form was irresistible, and the vision it offered was exactly what Europe needed at exactly the right moment. Marco Polo's book succeeded because it arrived at a hinge point in European history. The 13th century was ending. The medieval world was beginning to crack. The Crusades had opened routes to the east and then closed them again. The Mongol Empire had created unprecedented stability across Asia, making long-distance travel safer than it had been in centuries. But that window was already starting to close when Marco returned to Venice. Europe was hungry for information about the wider world. Not spiritual information, not theological speculation, practical information. What goods were available? What trade was possible? How far did one need to travel? What obstacles would one face? Previous travel accounts had been written by monks and missionaries. They focused on souls to be saved, heresies to be corrected, and the spiritual significance of distant lands. They were concerned with converting the East, not understanding it on its own terms. Marco Polo's book was different. It was written by a merchant for merchants. It catalogued resources. It described trade networks. It estimated distances and travel times. It noted which cities welcomed foreigners and which were hostile. It was practical intelligence delivered in an accessible form. The book also benefited from being written in French rather than Latin. Latin was the language of scholars and clergy. French was the language of courts and commerce. By choosing French, or having Rustichello choose it, the book reached a broader audience immediately. It could be read aloud at dinner parties. It could be discussed by traders planning expeditions. It didn't require a university education to access. Then there's the style itself. Rustichello wasn't just transcribing Marco's memories. He was crafting a narrative. He had spent years writing romance literature, stories of knights and adventures. He knew how to structure a tale. He knew how to create anticipation and deliver satisfying descriptions. He knew how to make distant places feel vivid and immediate. The book reads like an adventure because it was written by someone who understood adventure narratives. Each chapter introduces a new marvel. Each section builds on what came before. The pacing keeps you moving forward. Even the repetitive elements serve a purpose, creating a rhythm that makes the book easy to absorb even when read aloud over multiple evenings. Compare this to other travel accounts of the era. Most were organised geographically, but written in a dry, reportorial style. They listed facts without context or narrative drive. They were reference works, not stories. Marco Polo's book was both. You could use it to plan a journey, but you could also read it for pleasure. That dual nature made it uniquely powerful. The book also succeeded because it didn't ask readers to change their worldview fundamentally. It presented Asia as strange but comprehensible, exotic but organised, different but operating according to recognisable principles. Cities had governments, trade followed rules, wealth existed and could be accessed. This was crucial. If the book had presented Asia as completely alien, beyond European understanding, it would have been fascinating but not actionable. Europeans would have admired it from a distance, without seeing themselves as potential participants. Instead, Marco presented Asia as a place where European merchants could function, where the same skills that worked in Venice or Genoa could be applied in Hangzhou or Khanbalik. He also presented Asian rulers as rational actors. The Great Khan wasn't a mysterious potentate beyond comprehension. He was a powerful ruler who valued competence, rewarded service, and could be approached through proper channels. This made Asia seem less like a fantasy realm and more like an expanded version of the Mediterranean world Europeans already knew. The timing of the book's wider circulation mattered enormously. The original manuscript appeared in the late 13th century, but the real explosion of copies came in the 14th and 15th centuries. This coincided with several crucial developments. The rise of paper manufacturing in Europe made books cheaper to produce. The growth of universities created more literate readers. The expansion of merchant networks created an audience specifically interested in commercial intelligence, and most importantly, the collapse of the Mongol Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Turks cut off the overland routes to Asia, making Europeans desperate for alternative paths to Eastern wealth. By the time Columbus was reading Marco Polo in the 1480s, the book had become more valuable than when it was written. The information was outdated in some ways. The Mongol Empire was gone. The specific routes Marco described no longer existed. But the general picture of Asian wealth remained compelling, and the need to reach that wealth had become urgent. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 closed the Eastern Mediterranean to Christian merchants. The old Silk Road routes were no longer accessible. If Europeans wanted Asian goods, they needed new paths. Marco Polo's book didn't just describe the destination, it justified the search for alternatives. This is where we see the book's influence most clearly. Columbus wasn't trying to follow Marco Polo's route. He was trying to find a completely different way to reach the same destination. He believed he could sail west across the Atlantic and arrive at Cathay and Tipangu. The idea seems absurd now because we know the Americas were in the way. But Columbus didn't know that. He had Marco Polo's descriptions of Eastern Asia and Ptolemy's underestimate of Earth's circumference. Put those together, and a western route seemed not just possible, but logical. Columbus carried Marco Polo's book with him on his voyages. His personal copy still exists, filled with his annotations and underlinings. He marked passages about gold and spices. He noted descriptions of the Khan's court. He was using the book as a guide to what he expected to find. When he reached the Caribbean islands, Columbus initially believed he had succeeded. These must be the islands Marco described off the coast of Asia. The gold he had read about must be nearby. The Khan's empire must be just beyond the horizon. He died still believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia, never realizing he had stumbled onto continents that didn't appear in any European account. The Portuguese navigators used Marco Polo differently. They weren't trying to find a new route. They were trying to extend the known route around Africa. But Marco's descriptions of the Indian Ocean trade gave them specific targets. They knew which ports to seek. They knew what goods to expect. They had a mental framework for understanding what they found. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, he carried a copy of Marco Polo's book. When Portuguese ships pushed further east to the Spice Islands and eventually to China, they were following a trail Marco had blazed in text centuries earlier. They didn't always find what Marco had described. The Mongol Empire was long gone. China had changed dynasties, but the basic geography matched. The trade goods were real. The wealth Marco had promised existed. This validation mattered. The first European expeditions into the Indian Ocean were enormous gambles. They required years of preparation, massive investment, and acceptance of terrible risks. Many sailors never returned. Many ships were lost. But the potential rewards justified the risks because Marco Polo had described those rewards in concrete detail. He had made distant wealth feel real enough to pursue. The book's influence extended beyond exploration into how Europeans imagined themselves. Before Marco Polo, European Christians saw themselves as the center of God's plan. Jerusalem was literally placed at the center of medieval maps. The known world consisted of Christendom, surrounded by threatening pagans and heretics. Marco Polo's book complicated this view. It described civilizations that were older, richer, and more sophisticated than Christian Europe. The Great Khan's court made European kings look provincial. Chinese cities dwarfed anything in Italy or France. Asian merchants conducted trade on a scale that made Mediterranean commerce seem modest. This was humbling, but it was also energizing. If such wealth and sophistication existed elsewhere, Europeans could learn from it. They could trade with it. They could participate in a wider world rather than remaining isolated in their corner of it. The book helped create what we might call an expansionist mindset. Europe was no longer the whole story. It was one player in a larger game, a relatively small and poor player, actually, but one that could improve its position through intelligence, initiative, and boldness. This shift in perspective was subtle but profound. It moved Europeans from a defensive crouch to an aggressive stance. Instead of protecting what they had, they began seeking what they didn't have. Instead of viewing distant peoples as threats to be contained, they began seeing them as potential partners or competitors in a global system. The age of exploration didn't happen because of Marco Polo alone. Economic pressures, technological advances, and political competition all played crucial roles. But Marco Polo's book provided something essential: a vision of what was possible. It gave Europeans a reason to explore beyond mere curiosity. It described concrete goals worth pursuing. It made the risks seem acceptable because the potential rewards seemed real. And here's the remarkable thing: even though some of Marco's specific claims were exaggerated, even though some of his descriptions were second-hand, even though scholars now question whether he saw everything he claimed to see, the overall picture he painted was accurate enough. Asia was rich, China was sophisticated, the trade opportunities were real, the journey was possible. You can debate whether Marco Polo deserves credit for discovering these facts. Other travellers knew them. Arab merchants had been trading with China for centuries. But Marco Polo was the one who brought this knowledge to European attention in a form that inspired action. That's the final measure of the book's importance. Not whether every detail was true, but whether it changed what people did. By that standard, few books in history have been more consequential. The travels of Marco Polo helped launch the age of exploration. It influenced Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, and countless others. It helped create the mental maps that Europeans used to navigate their way to global dominance. It made Asia seem accessible at exactly the moment when Europeans were developing the technology and motivation to reach it. The book's influence faded eventually. Once Europeans had explored Asia directly, they no longer needed second-hand accounts. By the 17th century, Marco Polo was becoming a historical curiosity rather than a practical guide. But by then the work was done. The world had been connected. The global trading system that Marco had glimpsed in its Mongol form had been rebuilt under European direction. Whether Marco Polo actually made the journey he described matters less than we might think. What matters is that his book convinced generations of Europeans that such a journey was possible, that the rewards were worth pursuing, and that they could participate in a wider world than they had previously imagined. The teenager who left Venice in 1271, or didn't leave, depending on which scholar you believe returned or didn't return, to tell a story that changed history regardless of its literal truth. The book became more real than the journey. The vision became more powerful than the facts. This is how ideas work. They don't need to be perfect to be transformative. They need to arrive at the right moment, in the right form, speaking to the right needs. Marco Polo's book did all of that. It gave medieval Europe a glimpse of a larger world, precisely when Europe was ready to reach for it. And in reaching for that world, Europe found not just what Marco Polo had described, but entire continents he never mentioned. The book sent explorers looking for Asia. Instead, they found the Americas, redrew every map, and created the modern world. That wasn't what Marco Polo intended, assuming he intended anything beyond telling an interesting story. But that's what his words accomplished. The merchant's son from Venice, who may or may not have travelled to China, ended up travelling through time instead, his story pushing European ships across oceans and into the unknown. In the end, Marco Polo's greatest journey wasn't the one he claimed to have made. It was the journey his book took through European consciousness, transforming how an entire civilization understood possibility itself. Think about what actually happened here. A merchant returns to Venice with stories. Those stories get written down in a prison. The manuscript multiplies, mutates, spreads. Each copy reaches different readers who interpret it through their own needs and ambitions. Columbus reads it and sees a western route to Asia. Da Gama reads it and pushes around Africa. Merchants read it and calculate profits. Map makers read it and redraw boundaries. None of them could verify the source. None of them could fact-check the claims. But they believed, and belief was enough to move ships across oceans. This tells us something uncomfortable about how history works. Truth matters less than we'd like to think. What matters is what people believe to be true and what they do based on those beliefs. Marco Polo's book, accurate or not, complete or fabricated, gave Europeans permission to reimagine their world. That permission changed everything. We've spent centuries arguing about whether he actually went to China. We've analysed omissions, questioned chronologies, searched Chinese records for evidence, and we still don't know for certain. Maybe we never will. But here's what we do know. The book existed. It circulated. It influenced. Ships sailed because of it. Continents were discovered because of it. Trade routes were established because of it. The modern global system emerged partly because a book written in a Genoese prison convinced Europeans that Asia was reachable and worth reaching. The physical journey, if it happened, took 24 years and covered maybe 10,000 miles. The textual journey took 7 centuries and reshaped the entire planet. Which one mattered more? Marco Polo died in 1324, thinking he was just another Venetian merchant with unusual stories. He couldn't have imagined that his name would still be known 700 years later, that scholars would still debate his veracity, that his book would be credited with launching European expansion. He also couldn't have imagined the consequences. The wealth his book described was real, but accessing it required ships, which required navigation, which required technology, which required capital, which required empire. The line from Marco Polo to European colonialism runs through hundreds of intermediate steps, but it runs. Was that his fault? Of course not. He was describing what he saw or heard. He wasn't advocating conquest, but ideas have consequences that extend far beyond their author's intentions. Words travel through time, picking up momentum, bending in unexpected directions, crashing into circumstances their authors never anticipated. This is the strange truth about influence. The most powerful ideas aren't necessarily the most accurate ones. They're the ideas that arrive at the right moment, in the right form. Marco Polo's book succeeded not because it was perfect, but because it was perfectly timed. Europe needed a vision of the wider world. He provided one. What happened next wasn't his responsibility, but it was his legacy. So was Marco Polo a liar? Maybe. An exaggerator? Probably. A compiler of second-hand accounts? Possibly. Does any of that diminish what his book accomplished? Not even slightly. The teenager who may or may not have left Venice created something more durable than any journey. He created a story that moved the world. And in the end, that's the only journey that really mattered.